Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are located. I'm Delphine Adono-Ousu. I'm the Executive Director of UCAN. Welcome to this webinar on the impact of the pandemic on shipping between the EU and Canada. Before we start, I invite you to take a few seconds to answer the question that will appear on your screen in a few seconds. Here you are. It will help us to get to know you better. But because we are mindful of your time and without further notice, I invite Stephen Kluss, President of UCAN, to give us a few words.
Good morning to all of you in attendance today. And I'd just like to say it's a great pleasure to be collaborating with Mr. Christian Siviere, Solimpex today. This year, the European Union Chamber of Commerce in Canada marks its 25th year since inception, and I'm proud to say that we're looking forward to the next 25 years. UCAN, business voice of Europe and Canada, and is committed to supporting European business in Canada and from Europe. Of course, the global supply chain and air and sea freight is fundamental to our endeavors. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Stephen. I will just share the results of the poll right now. So now let's get in the very heart of the topic. I would like to first thank you and also introduce Christian Siviere, our guest speaker for today. He's an expert in international logistics in Europe and in Canada. He started an import-export consultancy in 2010, Solimpex. Christian is an expert and lecturer for the Canadian International Freight Forwarder Association in Toronto and for the World Federation of International Freight Forwarders in Zurich. He gives conferences and for various trade organizations and also training. So Christian will give us a presentation for the next 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll keep 15 minutes for the question and answers session. And do not hesitate to write your question in the chat box or in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll take all the questions at the end of the presentation. All right, thank you everyone, and Christian, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much, Delphine. Thank you very much, Stephen. And thank you for the European Chamber of Commerce in Canada to invite me to speak to you. And thank you, all our attendees from Europe, Canada, and elsewhere for allowing us into your office or your living room, wherever you might be. We are going to talk about the impact the pandemic has had on imports and exports, particularly focusing on the logistics aspect and how to get goods to market. That's the intent today. So Delphine has introduced me already, so we don't need to see this slide. Briefly, before we begin, I wanted to let you know about this webinar that Invest Ottawa is going to hold next Monday, May 25th, on the CETA Free Trade Agreement. So this is just for your information only. On today's agenda, we're going to first talk about air freight, air cargo, how to get goods by air between Europe and Canada. And we'll spend a little bit more time on that because it is more problematic than ocean freight. So after that, we'll talk about ocean cargo, how we get our ocean cargo smoothly and efficiently across. And we'll end with a few notes on the Canadian situation, as well as briefly at the end on trade between Canada and the US, because as you know, we have this special relationship with our partners or our neighbors south of the border. And questions at the end, of course, will be welcome. I look forward to engaging with you and discussing with you any points you may want to raise. So before we go into the substance of today's presentation, two things I want to mention briefly. The first one is that we know that there is a pandemic. Of course, nobody knows and nobody is not aware of that. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that the pandemic was effectively pronounced on on March 11. So what that means is that it has an impact on the legal clause of force majeure. You may have heard of that. You may have had suppliers who declared force majeure, or customers or service providers who declared force majeure. And then by saying that, or by declaring that, it sort of enables the party to get out of his or her obligations. So why do I mention that? Is that we have to be conscious of the fact that you cannot do this after March 11, because after March 11, the pandemic was known. So this force majeure situation or issue or provision, you can only use it for contracts that have been signed before March 11. So very brief little note on that. Incoterms is also something that everyone is, generally speaking, aware of when we trade in goods internationally. We all know Incoterms a little bit, but sometimes what people forget is that Incoterms don't just define the responsibilities and the obligations and the cost sharing of the parties. They also define the transfer of risks between the seller and the buyer. And so in times of crisis, when goods don't arrive or don't go the way they're supposed to go, it's important to realize that the Incoterm that we've used is going to tell us whether the issue is our problem or whether the issue is our customer's problem. So just a little aside on the international contracts and the fun of international trade. So big impact on air cargo, big impact on air transportation, big impact on flying, because many countries, as of mid-March, sort of either closed their airspace or banned flights, incoming flights. And so huge impact from it, of course, a huge impact on airlines themselves. So here I chose to illustrate a few airlines that Avianca. Of course, these are airlines that were already facing some difficulties before the pandemic, and the pandemic was the death knell for some of these airlines. And for all other airlines, we know that they are struggling because of this huge loss in revenue, sudden loss in revenue, because they're not flying, or they're flying only 5% of their flights, either because of government regulations or because there's just no demand, no market. Nobody wants to fly right now. And so we're having debates, we hear debates about this situation because many airlines are applying for government assistance. The one at the bottom right-hand side of your screen refers to US airlines getting huge bailout funds from the federal government. That is being criticized because some people feel that this money really is just used to prop them up until the elections, and then after the election as well. Some of them will be allowed to go bankrupt. Probably what will happen is that indeed some airlines will go bankrupt at one point or another, and will have potentially then less choices, which will potentially drive costs up. And so there's debates on that, on this bailout money that's going to airline, that's going to the travel industry. In Europe, there's Ryanair, who has filed complaints about French state help to Air France KLM, for example. So that's going to be an ongoing debate for the next little while. And right here in Canada, well, Air Canada has been impacted by the same as all other airlines. And just last week, they announced that they would cut their payroll by as much as 60%. So these are very tough times for the hospitality industry, for the travel industry, for airlines, for hotels, for airports, and also for ports. We'll see that in a moment. So the main thing to consider, or to keep in mind, and also to understand why it's more problematic to send goods by air nowadays, and also why it costs more, is because about 50% of air cargo that's being transported worldwide, and it's the same would apply with Europe, is transported on passenger planes, like we have highlighted on the picture that you see. So the cargo that we're shipping, that European companies are selling, the goods that they're selling in Canada, and the goods that are sold by Canadian companies and sent by air to Europe, half of them go on passenger flights, and about half of them go on cargo flights, now pure cargo flights. Now, and so why is it important to realize that, or to know these figures, is because it helps us understand why the market is so has been so upset by this pandemic, and why it's so expensive to send goods by air cargo right now. So imagine half of the cargo that's being shipped is shipped on passenger flights, and there's only about 5% of the usual passenger flights that we're seeing. So we have hardly any passenger flights. We have some left, but only about 5%, or you could go 5 to 10%. So you don't need to have a PhD in mathematics to see that if you lose this capacity for 50% of the cargo that you're transporting by air, then of course you're going to have a problem to ship your goods, and it's going to be more costly because you only have the other 50% of cargo flights that you can rely on. So that is, if you want, so the reason why it's difficult to send goods by air between Europe and Canada right now, and why it's more costly. Costs have gone up about 3, 4, 5 times. If you shipped goods in January or February for €1 a kilo, this week you might ship it for €4 a kilo. And the same happens, of course, it's even magnified on trade with Asia. So just to help us understand a little bit what's going on for air cargo, that's a cutout of an airplane. So you see a traditional passenger flight will carry cargo in what we call the belly, at the bottom, in the lower deck, where we also have the baggage, you know, the travelers' baggages. So cargo goes below deck in the belly, and then on the upper deck, or in the cabin, we have passengers. And so even though you might feel that you're on top of each other when you're going to travel sometimes, in fact, we're not on top of each other. So we all have a little bit of space, we all have seats. So of course, if you use that portion, that upper portion, the cabin, to ship cargo, then you want to pile it on top of each other. You want to maximize the space, and you cannot really do that today with passenger flights, because the structure of the passenger plane does not allow you to load too much weight on the upper level, on the main deck, or in the cabin. So it's useful to be able to use passenger flights for cargo only, but you can only take so much. You cannot take as much freight, as much cargo as you would take otherwise in a full cargo flight that was manufactured, built to allow freight to be loaded in the cabin. So that also explains why rates are still quite high, even though we have more options than we had at the very beginning of the crisis. So one of the options that we see, and we've seen personal protection equipment being sent on passenger flights this way. Now, many airlines have done this at the beginning of the crisis, and they still do to a certain extent. I chose this picture because it happens to be an Airbus A220, which is dear to Canadians because that used to be a Bombardier C-series aircraft, which has been renamed when the Bombardier was taken over by Airbus. So that's an Airbus A220 flying personal protection equipment between China and Riga in March. And so airlines have, because they no longer fly passengers, because it's either impossible or not allowed, or there's no demand, they've transformed some of their aircraft to carry cargo on the main deck in the cabin. So that's an example of an Air Canada Boeing 777 that has been converted to carry cargo. So all they do is the airline just has to remove the seats, and then it can load cargo on the upper deck in the cabin. Now, Air Canada was one of the early adopters of this tool, but many airlines around the world do that and have been doing that for some time. And so it's a way for airlines to supply flights and carrying capacity to the trade. It's also a way for airlines to keep their planes flying and to keep their pilots flying, because that's pilots. I mean, planes are of course the main asset financially, but the real asset of airlines is pilots. So you don't want to have your pilots just sitting around not doing anything. You want them to keep on flying. And so transforming passenger flights like this, removing seats to enable them to carry cargo, is a way for airlines to continue to operate, to continue to get their pilots flying, and also to bring revenues, which is extremely important nowadays. Now, you might ask me, how do we secure cargo? How do we secure the freight? Isn't it dangerous to ship freight like this in the cabin? And I would say, yes, it would be. So the way the airlines do this is they have nets that they wrap the cargo with, and then these nets are hooked to the railings that you see. The small rails at the bottom are the rails where seats are normally secured. So they'll secure these straps, these nets, tightly around the boxes or the pallets that they will load. The other limitation to load to send cargo by air in the cabin is the size of the door, which is smaller than a cargo door. So that's the main tool that we have at our disposal today to ship goods between Europe and Canada, and between Canada and Europe. They are passenger flights used as cargo flights, either just having freight in the belly, or if the airline has taken the step to remove seats, then they carry freight in the belly and in the cabin. So that's our main tool today. The other tool that we have available is the other 50% I was mentioning earlier, is cargo flights. So there's airlines that are specialized in carrying cargo only and don't carry passengers at all. And generally speaking, they're not very well known to the public, because the general public only knows the main airlines, the passenger airlines. Now, this one that I highlight in this picture, in this slide, is well known in Europe because it's a European company based in Luxembourg, Cargolux. It's not that well known in Canada. So these companies have always operated air cargo flights, cargo-only flights. Not so much in Canada. Cargolux have flights into Calgary, but that's all for, at this time. But they have flights from Luxembourg to New York and to Chicago, and they normally carry freight going to Canada as well, via New York or via Chicago, and then the freight is trucked to Toronto, Montreal, or wherever it's going to in Canada. So these air cargo, these pure cargo airlines are very important nowadays, because they're all of a sudden charged with carrying, almost 90% of whatever cargo is flying. So Cargolux is well known. Many cargo airlines are not well known to the public. So one tool, one source to find out about information about these cargo airlines is on the IATA website. They maintain a information database here on the status of air cargo airlines, which ones are flying today, and etc. So because of this surge in demand for personal protection equipment, I mean, in general, trade has slowed down, of course. There's less air cargo being shipped, generally speaking. But there's been a huge spike in demand to ship personal protection equipment, to ship masks, to ship gowns, to ship respirators. So, and this is what has driven the prices up, because all of a sudden we have far less flight, but we still have a very high demand because of the pandemic and because of the personal protection equipment requirements. So the good news is that on these cargo airlines, some have been expanding. So for example, Atlas Air had 3 747s that were parked that they were not using. So they've taken them back into the air. There's a UK cargo airline called Cargologic Air, which had stopped operating for the time being, because let's not forget that the environment, the business environment, the international trade environment in 2019 wasn't great as a result of the you know, the so-called trade war that the U.S. administration had initiated mainly against China, but also even sometimes against its own allies. And so trade was slowing down in 2019. So a lot of these cargo airlines had just parked planes for the time being. And so they are reactivating, they're getting these planes back. So there's more supply available. There's even something quite interesting, the Airbus A380, which airlines don't really like because they're too costly to operate for passenger flights. Lufthansa Technik has gotten a contract to convert an A380 passenger flight, because that's all that was ever built, this passenger version of the A380, to convert it to carry air cargo. So this is going to help us stabilize the market and make air cargo more affordable. So we also have charter flights that are coming every now and then. So that was a nice example of what can be done to carry personal protection equipment. We had one of these huge Antonov aircrafts carried personal protection equipment from China to Montreal back in at the beginning of the month on May 1st, I believe. They carry about 250 tons of cargo. But of course, these are special cases, and there's only one such aircraft around in existence flying today, so it's flying on demand, based on companies chartering the aircraft as they need, as there is a special requirement. So what are the options today to ship goods between Europe and Canada, or Canada and Europe by air? We have very few passenger flights, as we know. We all experience that, we all see that, we hear it, or in fact we don't hear it if we live close to an airport, right? We hear far less flights landing or taking off. I'd like to mention in this respect that the European Chamber of Commerce in Canada has a neat tool available on their website. They've taken an inventory of the airlines that are still flying between Canada and Europe. So that's very neat. So in Canada, you have to know that there's very few international flights allowed, and only 4 airports are allowed to receive international passenger flights at this time. It's Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver. And so there's very few of these. They still carry cargo in the belly, as we saw illustrated in one of the slides. But the main tool we have at the moment to send goods by air between Europe and Canada is these passenger flights that have been converted to carry cargo in the cabin. So we're carrying cargo only. So either in the belly or both in the belly and in the cabin. So that's the main tool we have at our disposal today. And we know that there's still flights available. Air Canada still flies. I'll give you an idea of their schedule in a moment. Air France still has 3 flights a week into Montreal. Lufthansa has about 3 flights a week, I think, from Toronto to Frankfurt. British Airways has also 3 flights a week. So many airlines have no flights right now, but many airlines have some flights, limited flight, and so they still exist. And then, so that's for passenger airlines carrying cargo. And the other option is these all cargo flights that I mentioned a moment ago, like Cargolux, Atlas Air, Airbridge. So these companies have always existed, and of course they're more solicited now. We don't have that many such flights operating into Canada, but there's quite a few operating into the US, and then the freight is trucked from the US to Canada, which is not ideal, but it's still an option at our disposal, and it works. It's slower, it can be problematic for some things, but for customs issues, for regulations, but it still works. And then we have the integrators. You know, by integrators we refer to these courier companies, FedEx, DHL, UPS, that carry small parcels for e-commerce. They have, of course, an important cargo carrying capacity because they own their own planes, and that's what all they do is carry cargo between their hubs around the world. And so that's an interesting option for us to ship goods into Canada. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that these integrators, these FedEx and DHL and UPS, they always go via a US hub. So when you're sending something from Europe, it goes via a hub in Europe, which is either in Leipzig or in Gatwick, or they have several such hubs, and then the cargo flies to a hub in Huntsville or in Memphis, Tennessee, or Huntsville, Kentucky, and then it's flown into Canada on smaller flights. So an important thing to keep in mind. Chartering, of course, is an option. If you have a big load to send, and you can always charter an aircraft, like many countries have done during the early stages of the pandemic and the emergency, the need to get personal protection equipment into the country quickly. And so all these cargo airlines have offerings of charter flights. One that is not very well known, but that has been running smoothly, is called CargoJet. CargoJet is a small Canadian airline that does only cargo. They have flights into Köln, Germany, and they've started to fly also into Brussels. And then, of course, the key to this is because airlines are huge organizations and they're not always accessible. So the key player in this industry really is the freight forwarder, the logistics service provider, because they have the relationship with the airlines, they have the network, they have the information, they also have the ability to consolidate shipments. If you have 5 tons and somebody else has 5 tons and somebody else has 10 tons, then that makes almost a full load and can be put together and sent off. Whereas if you only deal individually directly with airlines, it might not be so easy to put these together. So the current situation, which we would call the new normal, sky-high rates, which was, I guess, appropriate term for sending air cargo, sky-high rates, fewer flights, that we know, and high rates. So that we know, rates went up instantly because of a shortage of flights. So as I said earlier, if you were paying €1 in January or February, you're going to pay €5 today, and or €4 or $3.50. I mean, it all depends, but for sure, rates are not the same. Rates have just increased 3 times or 4 times or 5 times, depending on the lane that you're in and depending on the time frame. Another important aspect to keep in mind is that we have to take fast decisions nowadays because the market is changing very quickly. Space is tight. There's less options available. So if you need to move 5 tons of air cargo this week and some to Toronto or to Montreal, and you're sitting in Europe, and somebody offers you a reliable option at a rate that seems to be exorbitant, then don't take too long to take your decision. Don't say, oh, I'm going to think about it and get back to you tomorrow. If you get back to the party that's offering you that, then tomorrow the space will be gone. Somebody else will have taken it. And so it's very important to be well informed of the situation, of which airlines are flying again, and in order to be able to take decisions, quick decisions when needed. So here I just wanted to show you, as I said, UCAN has a very nice tool that gives you information on what flights still operate. This is the Air Canada cargo information. So you see they have, Air Canada still has daily from flights from Montreal to Paris, and from Toronto to Frankfurt, and Toronto to London, and they're starting flights into Brussels very soon. And I think it's not announced yet officially, but they're also starting to Amsterdam. They also can offer their planes on a charter basis. If you have one big shipment to make, then it's possible to rent a flight from Air Canada, rent the entire flight. But of course, that gets very expensive. So the good news is that airlines are starting to fly again. So Emirates, it was announced last week, Emirates are starting to fly, and they are starting to fly again, and they have Toronto on their schedule. So that's good news. Brussels Airlines, which I think had stopped flying completely mid-March or at the end of March, are going to fly again from June 15. Now, we don't know if Canada is on their is going to be served or not. But so it's just to give you an indication that things are moving in the right direction. We're going to have more flights, more options. And why do I mention Emirates? You might say, you might wonder what Emirates is, if Emirates is relevant to the Canadian trade. Well, yes, indeed. These airlines like Emirates or Qatar Airlines, even though I don't necessarily like to promote these airlines, I prefer to promote European airlines or Canadian airlines, but these Middle Eastern airlines are a good option to ship goods between Europe and Canada. They have flights from their Middle Eastern hubs to main cities in Europe, and they have flights into Canada as well, mostly Toronto, but also Montreal. So that's the picture for air freight right now. And now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about ocean freight. So to give you a perspective on ocean freight, first of all, to give us an idea of the size of the market, these are the capacities that are in service on a weekly basis between, so 142,000 TEUs or 20-foot equivalent unit. That's the small container that we see. You know, ocean containers, there's the small ones that are 20-foot containers, and then the large ones, 40-foot containers. It's the unit of measure we use in the transportation industry. So transatlantic means Europe, North America. That's 142,000 TEUs a week. That's the capacity that's on offer. And then as you see, Asia to Europe is by far, is 3 times actually the North Atlantic trade. So we are relatively small. And of course, these are the North American figures. So if we just take Canada, Canada is a small market in relation to the overall picture. And it's really Asia to Europe. That's the biggest train lane in ocean transportation. The second one is Asia to the west coast of North America. So all this to say that we're a small player, and but we still have all the major carriers serving Canada. We still have the biggest ocean lines in the world serving the Canadian market, but it's not their priority. And the Canadian market is not where they're going to make it or break it. It's really on the Asia lane that we will see potential changes, or that we might see, you know, if one company sort of gets into financial difficulties as a result of the pandemic and goes bankrupt, which might very well happen. It won't be because of the Canadian trade, it will be because of the Asian trade. Obviously. So container ships, if you're depending on which article you read and which time of the in relation to the pandemic is concerned. So we'll talk about the reduction in business of 10%. There's 10% less capacity, or trade has gone down by about 10%. Maersk predicts a fall in volume of about 25%. So indeed, ocean trade has been affected by the pandemic, and volumes are down. However, the difference with ocean freight is that of course, it's a slower process by definition. It's also evolving and moving more slowly. When you send goods by air, you know, they are manufactured today and then we ship them tomorrow, and they'll be on the market the day after tomorrow. Ocean is a much slower cycle. You're looking at a cycle of, you know, a couple of months at least. And so what is making things different in the way ocean carriers manage the situation compared to air carriers? Air carriers have very expensive costs, very high costs. It's also a very regulated industry. You can't just fly between Toronto and Brussels if you don't have traffic rights. And who has traffic rights right now? Air Canada, Brussels Airlines, and Air Transat. So if you start an airline tomorrow and you want to start flying from Toronto to Brussels, or from Copenhagen to Calgary, or from Helsinki to Montreal, then you have to apply. It's regulated. And then the other airlines that operate on that lane, they have a right of refusal. So highly regulated air transportation, also for safety reasons, but also I think for strategic reasons. Now, ocean freight is completely different. Ocean freight is largely unregulated. Of course, there's rules and regulations for safety, and there's conventions, and there's international agreements on ocean cargo, but it's not the same at all as air freight. If you want to start an ocean line tomorrow, to go between the port of Rotterdam and the port of Montreal, you're free to do that. As long as you follow the international rules, you don't have to apply to get your government's help to get the traffic right to sail into Canada. So all this to say, and I wanted to illustrate it with this picture of this Yang Ming vessel at the port of Halifax. This is a Fairview Cove container terminal at the port of Halifax. So on this picture, you see a Taiwanese vessel that's carrying containers from Yang Ming Line, which is a Taiwanese carrier. But you also see Hapag-Lloyd containers on that vessel. Hapag-Lloyd is a German company. You also see K-Line containers, NYK containers. They are Japanese companies. You see ACL, which is Italian. So what happens is ocean freight is that container lines work together. They work together in consortiums or in joint services or vessel sharing agreements. There's different names for different types of relationships, but basically they work together, and that's the reason why they are able to adjust their offering to the market demand. So if the market slows down a little bit, under normal circumstances, you'd see the rates plummet. You see rates go down. If the market picks up, you see the rates shoot up. But it actually doesn't quite work like this in ocean freight, because carriers work together and they adjust the demand, they adjust their service offering to the situation. So they've reduced sailings, particularly between Asia and Europe, but also between Asia and North America, and a little bit with Europe, and as a way to stabilize the market. Now, you might tell me this is this is a very odd situation. This is anti-competitive, right? Ocean lines working together to maintain services and also to adjust their offering based on market demand. And you would be right if you say that's anti-competitive. And why is it possible is because ocean carriers have a very unusual and specific exemption. And this exemption that enables them to work together to operate services in a way that will be less disruptive to the market. They get this exemption, in fact, thanks to an EU provision that has just been renewed earlier this year, or was it last year? I don't remember. No, it was this year in March, and it's been renewed for 4 years. So a long story to say, ocean carriers adjust in a different way to changing demands. And that's why we have a relatively stable business. That's why rates haven't really gone up by any stretch, particularly compared to air freight rates. And so what you see happening with ocean carriers is there's something called blank sailings. So if a carrier or a bunch of carriers or a group of carriers operates on a weekly basis between, let's say, Hamburg and Shanghai, they reduce their offering based on what they want to achieve to stabilize the market. So blank sailings means there's less options, but it stabilizes the market. And so what is the situation in Europe right now? And it's not so much because of the Canadian trade, of course, it's more because of the Asian trade. So in Europe right now, ports have been affected because there's been a reduction in cargo moving. Of course, we just saw figures from the port of Hamburg, I think yesterday. I think they're down by 6.6% for the first quarter. Gdansk was down 3%. Le Havre was down 20%, but then there's specific circumstances. In France, there were strikes at the beginning of the year, and so that has affected their volume. In Italy, the worst hit country in Europe, at least at the beginning, that had a big impact on ports. Some Italian ports saw a reduction of 50%. I got this nice postcard from the port of Halifax where they say business is operating normally. Trade is down. Volumes are a little bit down, but not drastically. And ships are going back and forth between Europe and Halifax with no problem. They're able to ship cargo by rail to Canada. There's one exception where things are a bit problematic. It's for automobiles. Most automobiles or all the automobiles that come from Europe and some that come from Asia as well, land in Halifax. So if you're driving the streets of Toronto in a BMW or a Volkswagen or a Fiat, it came into Halifax and then it was railed to Toronto or Montreal or wherever. These companies are because the market has slowed down so much, the demand has slowed down, they have difficulties storing the vehicles, and so that is a problem for that. The Port of Montreal is operating normally, carriers are operating normally. They're just starting to see a reduction in volume. So April was particularly interesting. April was already had a big reduction in volume, but aside from that, the fact that the volumes are down, ships are operating normally between Montreal and Europe. So as you know, we have two loops between Montreal and Europe, one covering North Europe twice a week and one covering South Europe also twice a week. That service is being consolidated in June. There will just be one loop, so that may have an impact on space availability and rates. To look at a Canadian perspective, the ones of you who are in Canada, you know about this, that we had this rail blockade that was quite impacting our supply chain just before the pandemic started. So throughout, a little bit throughout January, but mainly in February, we had big issues with rail transportation in Canada. So that had quite an impact. And then that was solved just 1 week before the pandemic started. So it was not, so in a way, the Canadian supply chain was a little bit disrupted already before the pandemic. This is a snapshot of what's happening today with respect to the COVID-19. The impact has been more on Quebec and Ontario, which are the most populous provinces in Canada. I don't know why it's more acute in Quebec. And as far as getting back to work, getting back to normal, each province decides which activities are going to get back. So I just wanted to illustrate this with this announcement from the government of Ontario as to which activities are going back. And so it might be different. It is different in Quebec. It is different in BC. But the main thing to keep in mind is that transportation is considered an essential service all across Canada. So whatever deals with transportation, delivering goods, trucking companies, ports, airports, that works 100%. A nice boost for importers was given by the Canadian government, a delay in paying duties and taxes from March, April, May till the end of June. Our trade, our international trade started to be impacted. We just got the March figures recently, last week. We won't get the April figure until the first week of June. So that's where we'll probably see an important reduction. And in closing, how are things moving with the US? I want to touch very briefly on that before I give you the opportunity to exchange and bring questions. I just want to say that business with the US works fine. We hear that the border is closed, so that might give the wrong impression to people. Indeed, the border is closed, but to non-essential services. So that means that goods travel freely between Canada and the US, and trucks go back and forth. So there's no real issue. There's a reduction in volume, but trade still flows nicely. Now, why is that important for the Canadian economy? Because 3/4 of our exports go to the US. So, of course, it's extremely important for Canada to be able to continue to trade with the US and to keep the border open for goods and essential services. And briefly to end on this positive note, I wanted to say that for those of you who don't know, the NAFTA free trade agreement, which ties Canada, the United States, and Mexico, has been renegotiated, and the new version is going to be in effect on July 1st, which is very good news for Canadian companies because it removes the uncertainty that had been created by the renegotiation process and the Trump administration threatening to cancel NAFTA. So that's out of our way. On Canada Day, July 1st, we'll have the new agreement. The new NAFTA will be in place. So it's great news for Canadian businesses and important for European companies that do business in Canada and that might also be interested in serving the US market from their Canadian base or their Canadian distribution center. So briefly to end, on air cargo, there's going to be probably some airlines that will disappear, so more consolidation, higher costs, and less options. On the other hand, we've seen already this week that rates are starting to come down a little bit. So, and we saw there's more flights coming in the summer, so that's going to be helpful. On ocean transportation, we can see that because of the way ocean carriers operate together, they are able to adjust their offerings, and so that has given a relatively stable freight market. So rates haven't gone up really, they've stayed very stable. There's slightly less options available, and sometimes there's delays because of this blank sailings that we touched on a moment ago, but I would say it's operating pretty smoothly for now by ocean freight. So it's not a big problem. And so to end on hopefully a fun note, there's more flights coming soon. We'll have more options. We'll be traveling more, we hope. Are we going to be traveling in those conditions, as what people refer to the cattle car in North America, or are we going to be having the luxury of an empty middle seat? I guess this is what we will see. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd like to open the floor for questions, please.
Thank you very much, Christian, for this presentation. I think it was very complete and really allows attendees to understand how it goes between Europe and Canada. I just wanted to touch base on something you said. Of course, trade between Europe and Canada, we are still in small player, but we hope that with the CETA and in the coming months, that will become also a big player. So we had some few questions during the presentation. So I will start with the first one. So we have a question, as airlines convert airplanes to cargo, will this result in a drop in air cargo cost in the next year or so?
I think no, not directly. I think what will impact air costs, air transportation costs, is to get more passenger flights going, and then because that comes automatically with a cargo carrying capacity. Converting air passenger planes to cargo, I think, is just an interim measure. It enables airlines to generate revenue, to get cash in, and also to get their pilots flying and to keep their slots at airports. But I think in the long term, I don't think it's as profitable for them as to carry passengers. So I think they'll go back to passengers whenever they can. But in the meantime, it's helping us a lot. And so it's more, what will make rates go down is more as we get more of the passenger flights going.
Okay, thank you. And from the same person also, we had a second question. How are the integrator profits during the COVID? Have their price increased?
Well, they've tried to introduce price increases every now and then. They're doing great. They're a little bit submerged. They're overwhelmed. Don't forget that there's been a huge spike in e-commerce. So they're doing great. They're making money, as far as I know, and they're having a hard time coping with demand. And that's not just COVID. It's also, we have to realize there's been a huge increase in e-commerce in general, and so the pandemic has made that worse, if you want. So, like everybody buys more and more online, so there's more demand. So they're doing great, and they're having a hard time coping with demand. And they've increased their prices a little bit whenever they could. And so it's really on the merchant side. The merchants absorb the shipping costs. This is the particular thing about e-commerce is that, and these integrators, is that this thing of this crazy notion of free shipping, is really quite anchored now in e-commerce. And so the retailer, the merchant, might absorb the shipping cost, even though the shipping cost is going up.
Okay, next question. Is the UK still trading under the European Union regulations?
Yes, they are, absolutely. And unless we're advised otherwise, it will be so until December 31st at 11:59 p.m.
Great, useful information. Another question, can you please comment again on CETA? Is there a provision within CETA that accommodates the current shutdown of economic activity, something which is less extreme than force majeure? Thank you.
No, I don't. I'm not aware of any provision in CETA that will help us with that. CETA just facilitates trade and reduces costs because it reduces tariffs and customs duties, and it opens up markets. It opens up public markets, public procurement, and makes it easier to trade goods. But it doesn't really help us directly, deal directly. I mean, it helps us indirectly, but it doesn't directly help us really to deal with the pandemic.
Yeah. And another question around CETA. I just take this opportunity. If any of you have more questions around CETA, please feel free to contact us. You can at info@ucan.com. We'll be happy to answer your question around CETA. Should we also consider the political aspect to import-export? Even before the pandemic, one could no longer bring in cheese using such sites as fromage.com. It is still harder to see more quality European cheese variety in stores, even with CETA. Will Canada not retrench towards more protectionist policies that current situation encourages?
Yes, I mean, there'll be an overall drive towards protectionism. I mean, we have examples of that south of the border. So yes, there'll be a drive to reshoring of industries and to buy local. This, of course, has limits. It won't happen overnight, and Canadians won't accept to only eat potatoes and cabbage and apples. They'll want to continue to eat figs and papayas and avocados and have nice clothes made in Europe. I think they'll continue to want that, or at least we hope they do. So there'll be, on the one hand, yes, a drive towards more reshoring, more protectionism. On the other hand, it won't happen overnight, and it won't be so easy. If your stove breaks down, you won't have much choice. You may have to buy a stove made in China because you may not be willing to pay 3 times that amount of a stove made in Canada, so it's not so easy to. It will have an impact, but it won't shut down trade completely.
We have a few more questions. How can e-commerce companies improve to help the greater demand?
I'm sorry, to improve what?
How can e-commerce companies improve to help the greater demand?
Well, that's what they're doing now, and so the stores that are surviving, actually, every week we hear about store closures. It started with Sears a while ago, and then it continues with Payless Shoes, and then last week or 2 weeks ago it was Aldo Shoes in Canada, and in the US there's a couple of chains. JCPenney filed for bankruptcy. So I think what's happening today is that e-commerce is that we don't go shopping as much, of course, because we can't. We can't because we're confined, we're in lockdown, or because the stores are closed for the time being as per government orders. And so e-commerce, everyone is buying online, and the stores, the retailers that are not well organized to deal with online commerce are going to disappear. And the ones that have been able to transform themselves to have an online offering will stay in business more than likely. And so e-commerce is helping in a sense that it's making it possible to still eat and function and work by buying goods online until such time that we can go and buy them again in stores. So the real question is how many of the brick and mortar retailers will survive after this, because they've been shut down, they've been closed for a while, and because I think not everyone will be satisfied with just shopping online. We also want to go out. We are social animals. We want to be able to go to a store, interact with a merchant, look at merchandise, touch it and feel it, sorry. So e-commerce is a great tool today to help us sort of survive in this environment.
Yeah. And actually, I'm jumping on a question that just came, and I guess the answer is in the question, but I would like to hear your comments. Is this a great opportunity for EU producers to take advantage of the move away from China's supply chains for Canadian importers?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's you hit it right on the nail. There's a lot of question about China, about China's management of the crisis, how the information was kind of hidden for 2 months or a month and a half, and I think that some companies will look at alternate sources of supply, and will buy more local, will look more local, but will also look more towards Europe. So I think Europe, yes, is it's a great opportunity for European products to because we are so close geographically, culturally, historically, and so it's therefore much easier for a Canadian customer or potential customer to consider sourcing products in Europe than to source them in Asia. So yes, it's a wonderful opportunity for European products, I think. I'm
Also
convinced.
Yeah, and also now that we have the CETA framework, also of course it will help.
It makes it a lot easier. That's right. Yeah.
Exactly. So we have two last questions. The next one, I don't know if you you have a straight answer, but do you see that there will be increased demand for passenger travel in the next couple of months? I guess it all depends on the situation, but Christian.
Yes, I mean there is increased demand. Yes, because we want to travel, but it will be done slowly, and also we're heading into the summer month, at least for the Western Hemisphere. So or the Northern Hemisphere. People want to take vacations, but I think it will happen slowly, and we also have to expect that we will pay more for flying. I think we can't expect to pay the same price. Air tickets will double, at least in the initial stage, until then, if things get back to normal quickly, then that will mean more flights, and that will mean more competition, and then it will stabilize the market. And but it will first ticket prices, I think, will be much more costly in the short term.
I have since we have a few minutes left, I have an interesting question that came. We have heard from some Canadian companies that logistics firms are charging higher rates for commodities qualified to be duty-free under several free trade agreements that Canada is party to. Have you run into similar issue? Do you have an insight why it happens?
So we talk about customs duties paid on goods that come in spite of the fact that there should be no duties because they're covered by a free trade agreement, right?
Yeah, I think
yes?
That's what.
Yep. So
yeah.
I think basically there's two reasons: maybe lack of information, and maybe laziness. I mean, maybe some people are not aware that there's provisions in free trade agreements, or maybe some people just don't want to bother doing the extra research or the extra validation or the extra paperwork. I mean, for goods to qualify under a free trade agreement, you need an origin certification that has to have a specific format. Sometimes people don't get that, and they say, well, it's not worth the trouble, so we'll pay the duties anyway. So I think it's often a lack of information, and also companies not willing to take the additional step, shall we say. But the good news is that if you have brought goods into Europe, Canadian goods into Europe, or European goods into Canada, and you've paid customs duties, whereas you should not have paid duties, you can apply for a refund. In fact, you have 3 years to do that.
All right, great. So I think we are coming to an end of this webinar. I'm just sharing with our audience 2 quick questions.
Yes.
And Stephen, maybe if you want to have some closing remarks. And first, I would like to really thank Christian for your presentation. I think it was very useful for everyone. And again, thank you. As it's recorded, as you can see, it's been asked. We will put it on our YouTube channel so you can share with whoever in Europe or in Canada. So again, thank you. And I see from the poll that you are all interested in having more webinar on the EU-Canada relations. So that's a great news, and this is why we are here. So again, thank you very much, Christian. And Stephen, if you want to say some closing remarks.
Thank you all very much for participating. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you to everyone for participating today and taking the time. I just wanted to make a closing comment, or maybe a question also to Christian. Just even during this period of pandemic, do you, in your research and monitoring, see any recent maybe situations that qualify as a success story in movement between trade channels between Canada and Europe? I thought it, in some discussions recently, maybe this is not current news, but one of the I think it's Chantier Davy shipbuilders in Quebec have done some, let's say, consolidation, as you used earlier, with shipbuilders in the Baltic coast yards like Finland, I believe Denmark, Poland, perhaps Sweden. Does anything like that pop into your head in terms of current success stories?
Well, there's not, some of these sometimes are not highly publicized. People, sometimes companies prefer to not to publicize too much, but I know, yes, it's a fact that, yes, some companies are taking the opportunity of the CETA agreement also, not just to buy or sell goods, but also to create partnerships and to create partnerships in the service industry as well. And so there's many such stories. This may have been, this has slowed down, of course, because of the pandemic, but I think companies should do well to prioritize this now, as we are slowly getting out of this very difficult situation, and prepare for the future and work on partnerships with counterparts on the other side. So there's great opportunities for companies, not just in trading of goods, but also in services, to work more closely between the European Union and Canada. And as you know, Canada is also a great stepping stone into the US market because we're so close.
Yes. Well, I thank you again for this great presentation, Christian. Thank you very much, Delphine, for carrying the presentation today. And I look forward to doing this again and having all the members of the audience join us again. We'll keep you in touch with our future endeavors.
Exactly. Thank you very much to all the participants. And just as I wrote in the chat box, feel free to send us an email at info@ucan.com if you want to receive our newsletter, or if you want to be aware of our next event. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day or evening. Bye.
Bye for now. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.